Poh Tiong, you have been writing about wine for a very long time and have been among the first in Asia to do so. You have been publishing in famous magazines as Decanter, but you are too an organizer of Asian food and wine scene, and you organize an international congress of Chinese cuisine and wine, who has been held in Beijing on your initiative. You are the publisher too of Chinese Bordeaux Guide, who is published once a year in China. So you won't be surprised if I start by asking you, when did you start writing about wine and why did you choose to do so?
Well, I started at university because I became interested in wine and I started drinking a bit before that. My father was very generous. He started drinking wines and there was always wine in the house. So I started drinking wine because it was free.
How old were you?
Well, I was, I think, about 17 or 18. So from there, it was an extension of something I liked, which I wrote about. At university, I wrote about fiction. Well, I reviewed books, books of fiction, and also I wrote about wines and sometimes travel. So that was how I started.
But at this time, did you were accustomed to reading about wines in English, or did it started like that in your mind, something completely new?
I started reading in English. My first and still my favorite author is Hugh Johnson, who today is a friend. I'm very lucky to say he's a friend. And of course, the real education in wine is opening the bottle and drinking it. So I've been lucky in the sense that I had on-the-job training constantly through drinking.
But as a student, it's a bit weird to drink wine at the time, no?
Well, not really. I suppose it's fair to say not many students drank wine, but I did.
You were in Singapore?
Yes, I was in Singapore where I started my university, and then I transferred my credits to New Zealand where I finished it. And my father is a very generous man, so when I was an overseas student, he gave me a very a nice allowance. So I went to restaurant regularly and I bought wine and I drank wines practically every day. But to give it some kind of focus, I drink Chinese tea too, I drink coffee. So it's part and parcel of everything of what I consider a complete life.
And did you start by French wines?
Initially, yes. I think, no, sorry. When my father started drinking, it was German wines. Rieslings, white wines, and then of course curiosity, makes you try everything. And France always, in most people's eyes, represent the apex of expressions of so many different varietals, whether it's Chardonnay, whether it's Cabernet Sauvignon, whether it's Syrah. So from German wines, I went on to try wines from the whole world. So
you won't be surprised too if I ask you, do Chinese cooking really match with wine, and especially French wines? Because it's a great question for Bordeaux.
Oh, it's very easy. I just finished last 2 weeks ago. I started a new wine competition called PerfectPairingsawards.com. So we took the competition to Beijing, Hong Kong and Singapore, and in each city we paired the wines that are entered. We don't judge the wines on their inherent quality, we judge the wines on the suitability with the dishes. So in Beijing we had Peking duck, we had a Shantung dish of braised sea cucumber, and we finished with a Sichuan very famous dish called Kou Sui Ji, which is chicken served with a marinade of Sichuan peppercorn and dried chilies and other herbs. So the judges, including Mr. Ta Tong, who is a celebrity in Peking, everybody knows Mr. Tong. He has a chain of Peking duck restaurants. So they all tried all the wines with all the dishes and decide which is compatible, which is not. Now, I have to emphasize that even without this competition, it's very clear that when you pair red wines with food, French food or any food, the most important consideration in red wine are the tannins. That's the most important. If the tannins are young, powerful, aggressive, even violent, especially when they're young or overly extracted, you can't pair them with food. I mean, you wouldn't be able to drink a red wine with aggressive tannins with confit de canard. So why should you be able to drink it with Chinese food? So the most important consideration for red wine is that the tannins must be resolved and evolved. So if you have that softness, it's very easy to pair with food. But doesn't mean that just with soft tannins you can pair with any food. But if the tannins are not yet resolved and evolved, it's very difficult to pair with any food. Of course, if the tannins are still quite strong, then you have a dish with maybe very strong flavors or aromas or very rich sauce that can help mitigate the tannins. Just as you would, I mean, if for example you're drinking white or red wine and if you have cassoulet, which is very rich and it's got lots, it's like a stew. If you have a very tannic wine, it can help soften the tannins. But if you have a simple dish with very little sauce, aggressive red wines are very difficult.
And about white wines, seafood and fishes are very important in the Chinese cuisine.
For sure.
So do you think they can match with white wines as we do in France?
Oh, very easy. I mean, if you had, for example, deep fried prawns, or let's say a Japanese cuisine tempura, you have no problem drinking that with sancerre or entrée de mer because you need the freshness, the acidity, the vivacity. It's like a handkerchief. It wipes away the grease. But if you have, say, a fish that is with lots of omega-3, very oily, let's say Japanese tuna, toro, the stomach, or a Chinese dish where they use cod, which is quite a buttery, fat fish, as opposed to, let's say, mackerel. If you have fish that is very high in the omega-3, lots of fatness, then a very high acid wine won't work. The acidity will bounce off that fatness. And then the wine becomes very metallic. Then you don't want a high acid white wine. You want a white wine that, again, maybe the richness of the fruit of the vintage and maybe the oak, which is softened. So if you have a Grave or a Pessac Liognon, which is evolved 5-10 years, to drink that kind of wine with, say, scallops, oyster, is no problem. And high acidity wine with seafood or dim sum that is maybe more greasy, more oily, if it's deep fried.
In the Gansu province in China, wine has been produced for more than 2,400 years, long before my own ancestors were introduced to wine by the Romans. So what kind of story do the wine tell in China? Does it feel as a drink of the past, the drink of the day, or maybe something for the future on which you can speculate?
Well, it is true that wine has a long history in China. It came from the West, from the Middle East, probably through the Silk Road, the Persians and the Arab traders. And even today in Xinjiang, which is the westernmost part of China, the frontier, which is predominantly Muslim, Xinjiang is very famous for its raisins, for its honeydew melons, for its tomatoes. So wine in China has had a long history, but I think we have to remember that it's a sporadic history. Wine production in China from grapes has not been continuous, has not been an unbroken tradition, whether it's, say, in the Middle East or in Greece or in Georgia or in France. Why didn't it continue? We don't know for sure, but my theory is that grapes, because they were not grown throughout the empire, and China has always been an empire, north, south, east, west. At one time, it stretched to, during the Han Dynasty, it went as far as Korea, what we know as Korea today, and to Mongolia, and as far almost as Vietnam, and then, of course, very far. So grapes were not cultivated throughout the empire, only in certain parts of the empire, and mostly in, as I mentioned, the West. So China did not have this continuity of wine production. And my theory is that when grapes were sometimes, if you can imagine 2,000 years ago, grapes would have been quite precious because they were seasonal. And because not every part of the empire grew it, when let's say the emperor or the aristocrats, they can have grapes, why make it into wine, which may not survive the long journey? If you have grapes, it was already so precious. So maybe the grapes themselves would have cost more than the wines, which made no reason to have the wines. And don't forget also that the Chinese, at that time, they have a grain-based fermented wine for a very long time. We know this from history that even during the Shang Dynasty, 3,500 years ago, they were drinking alcohol from fermented from grains. No Moutai, no distilled alcohol until the Song Dynasty. And the Song Dynasty was only 960 to 1279. So distilled alcohol in China, only a 1,000-year-old history.
Otherwise, the Chinese government is campaigning against drinking baijiu, which is a very strong liquor, which was very appreciated so far in the Chinese restaurants. Can it be a good thing for wine, for drinking wine? Do you think it could replace?
I don't think completely, not entirely. You have to understand the Chinese psyche. Chinese people like to kanpei or bottoms up. What are the reasons for it? Sometimes it's a bit of a machismo, but mainly it's historical. Chinese people are almost Latino, very warm. So to drink and kanpei, meaning a dry cup or a dry glass, is to show your affection, your sincerity towards another person. It's the bonding of a friendship or a business relationship. So in that sense, to bottoms up is part of the culture. And of course, when the Chinese move on from one kind of alcohol to another, I do this in my writing. I remind Chinese people that whilst socially it's part of our culture to drink alcohol like that, when it comes to wine, we should also try and understand the culture of wine. That to really show you are a sophisticated wine drinker, a knowledgeable wine drinker, is not to bottoms up the glass of wine. So, and I think slowly...
Different timing. You have to take your time.
Precisely, precisely. The glass does not just symbolize what you can do with to seal your friendship, but the glass itself holds something which has a strong cultural meaning. So I remind my Chinese readers, whether when I'm writing my blog for Sina.com or my magazine articles, that we have to be sensitive to the culture of wine. And this is not going to happen overnight, but it's happening already. Certainly not just by my efforts, by many other people's efforts.
I read by a French man set up in China, Bruno Pomar. I don't know if you know him. He rules a vineyard in China, and he claims that certain regions of central China will give very soon very fine wines. And he mentions Ningxia, or the Gansu, of course, Gansu. Do you think the French wines can remain competitive forever?
I think the most of us think, you know, China is quite a big country in size and geography. So logically, we like to think that there must be some terroir somewhere where you can grow great wines. I'm not sure. I don't know for sure. And even my friends who work as wine growers in China, I'm not sure. But mentioning Ningxia, for decanter, I'm also regional chair for Decanter World Wine Awards for the wines of the Middle East, Far East, and Asia. So for the first time this year, we had a gold. First time ever, a gold from China. It's a wine from Ningxia, which is, Ningxia is north-central China, it's south of Inner Mongolia, and north of Shanxi. It also has quite a sizable Muslim population, and the wines so far have been quite impressive. Pinot Rica, for example, has a wine made in Ningxia called Helen Mountain, because Helen Mountain, this area, is a sub-region within the province of Ningxia. So I think Ningxia is impressive. Hebei, which is, Beijing is independent, it's not part of a province because it's a capital, but Beijing is inside Hebei province. Hebei, I think, has great potential too. Shandong has been growing grapes a long time. The joint venture between the domain, the Baron Philippe, Baron Rothschild of Lafite, they have a joint venture. So the wines, I think, will appear in about, maybe the first vintage in about 2 years. We'll find out how good it is. There are already vineyards there. But you must remember also in Ningxia, it's so cold in winter. It can get down to minus 25. The vines have to be buried in the ground to keep them warm. So China is growing grapes, is making wines, some of them quite good, but I don't see present vineyards that China at the moment, with what is being grown in those vineyards, can make wines to rival a Cru Classé in Bordeaux.